The knife came out of nowhere, and Samuel Wells only lived because Borgakh Frostwolf's arm slammed across his chest and threw him backward into a stack of grain barrels. "Move," she growled, already stepping into the space where he had been standing, and the blade that had been meant for his throat instead scraped along the vambrace on her forearm, screeching off the iron studs like a struck bell. The man who had thrown it, broad-shouldered, painted in the red and black clan markings of the Ashfang line, did not even have time to reach for a second blade before Borgakh closed the distance and drove her elbow into his jaw hard enough to spin him off his feet and into a cart of pumpkins. The harvest fair went silent for one long breath. Then it exploded into noise again, merchants shouting, children crying, a piper somewhere still stubbornly finishing his tune before he realized nobody was listening anymore. Samuel scrambled up from the barrels, heart slamming, and looked at the orc woman standing over the fallen clansman with her chest heaving and her braid come loose across one shoulder. She was not looking at the man she had just flattened. She was looking at Samuel, checking him, her eyes moving over him the way a soldier checks a wall for cracks after a siege engine's first strike. "You are unhurt," she said. It was not a question. It was a fact she was confirming for her own sake. "Ah yes, thanks to you." His voice came out steadier than he felt. "That's the third time this week." "Fourth," Borgakh said, and finally looked down at the groaning man in the pumpkins. "Get up, Drenach, before I decide the ground suits you better." The man called Drenach Ashfang pushed himself up on one arm, blood at the corner of his mouth, and there was no shame in his face at all, only a kind of hungry, wounded pride, the look of a man who believed the world owed him something and could not understand why it kept refusing to pay. He was handsome in a hard way, all corded muscle and old scars, a clan champion's braids threaded with bronze rings down both sides of his skull. "You waste yourself on him," Drenach said, wiping his mouth, his eyes flicking to Samuel with open contempt. "A human, a landless nothing who cannot even hold a blade steady." "He does not need to hold a blade," Borgakh said. "That is what I am for." The words should have comforted Samuel. Instead, they landed somewhere low in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, because he had heard her say some version of that sentence at least a dozen times in the 2 months since she had taken up the post of guarding him through this endless, sprawling autumn fair. And every time she said it, it sounded less like duty and more like something else he did not dare name. The fairground stretched for nearly half a mile along the river road outside the walled market town of Kelder's Bend. Tents and stalls thrown up in every direction, drawing traders and farmers and clanfolk from 3 days' ride in every compass point to buy and sell before the first snows shut the passes. Samuel had come here under the name he had worn for 3 years now, Samuel Wells, a horse trader of no particular importance, because the name he had been born with, the name that had once carried a knight's spurs and a lord's trust before both were stripped from him in disgrace, was a name he could never speak aloud again without inviting questions he could not answer. Borgakh Frostwolf had come to Kelder's Bend because her clan, the Frostwolf line, held old trading rights along this stretch of river, and because 6 years ago she had killed a man in single combat before 400 witnesses and had never once let anyone forget it. She was hired now, when she chose to be hired, as a sword for coin, and Samuel, who dealt in horses good and bad and could not always tell the difference until it was too late, had needed a sword badly enough that he'd spent nearly everything he had to secure hers for the length of the fair. He had not expected, when he handed over his coin that first gray morning, that the woman taking it would be beautiful in a way that made his mouth go dry. Drenach spat blood into the dirt near Samuel's boot, not quite touching it, but close enough to be an insult all its own. "Frostwolf blood does not mix with dirt, farmers and coin lenders," he said. "Your father promised you to me before he died." "You know this." "My father is dead," Borgakh said, "and dead men do not get to promise what is not theirs to give. The clan council may see it differently. The clan council may see whatever it likes from a distance. Come closer to test it, and you will see me instead." She said it flatly, without heat, the way another person might comment on the weather, and Samuel understood in that moment, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, exactly how dangerous the woman standing beside him truly was, and how casually she wore that danger, like a second skin. Drenak rose fully to his feet, brushed pumpkin pulp from his leathers with as much dignity as he could gather, and gave Samuel one final look, head to boot, the kind of look a man gives a stray dog he is deciding whether to kick. "Enjoy your borrowed guard, little horse trader," he said. "Guards are hired. Wives are chosen. We will see which one you keep." He turned and walked off through the crowd, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds part for men who are used to being feared. And Samuel became aware, all at once, that half the fairground was staring at him, and at Borgakh with the particular flavor of curiosity that humans reserved for anything involving an orc and a human standing closer together than strictly necessary. "You're bleeding," Samuel said, because it was easier than saying anything else, and reached for her forearm before he had fully thought about whether he was allowed to. Borgakh looked down at the shallow scrape along her vambrace where the knife had skidded, a thin line of green-tinged blood welling up beneath the leather strap. "It is nothing. It's not nothing to me." He said it before he could stop himself, and then felt his face heat, because it had come out with more feeling in it than a horse trader owed his hired guard. She looked at him for a long moment, her golden eyes narrowing slightly, not with anger but with something more careful, more assessing the same look she'd worn the very first day they'd met, when he had come to the mercenary post at the edge of the fairground and asked, stammering, whether she might consider guarding a man who could not pay very much and had nothing impressive to offer in return. "Come," she said finally, turning toward the medicine stalls at the edge of the grain market. "If it will trouble you otherwise, I will let you fuss over it, but only because the fussing seems to please you, not because the wound requires it." Samuel followed her through the crowd, and did not argue the point, because she was, as usual, entirely right. They had met 2 months earlier on a morning thick with river mist, when Samuel Wells knew to Kelder's Bend, new to the name he wore, still learning how to walk through the world without flinching every time a herald's horn sounded in case it heralded his old life catching up to him. Had gone looking for protection he could barely afford and found instead a woman sharpening a greataxe on a whetstone the size of a dinner plate. Sitting on an overturned crate outside a mercenary post with her boots propped up, and her expression suggesting she would be perfectly happy if nobody spoke to her for the rest of the season. She had not looked up when he approached. "I am not for hire to men who cannot look me in the eye when they speak," she had said before he'd said a word. He had looked her in the eye. It had cost him something to do it. She was easily a head taller than him even seated, all corded muscle beneath fitted leather armor the color of old rust, a bodice laced tight across a powerful chest, and cinched at a waist that curved sharply before flaring into strong hips, the leather worn soft and dark with years of use, plaited at the shoulders and forearms but otherwise close-fitted, built for a warrior who needed speed as much as protection. Her tusks were modest as orc tusks went, more felt than seen when her mouth was closed, and her skin was a deep mossy green scored with old scars, one through her eyebrow, one along her jaw, one disappearing beneath the collar of her armor that he did not ask about. Her black hair was bound in a single thick braid over one shoulder, and her eyes, when he finally met them, were a startling amber gold, sharp with intelligence and utterly without fear. "I'm looking him," Samuel had said, which was not clever but was true. Something in her face had shifted then, not quite a smile, but an easing, a small crack in the wall she kept up against the world. "What do you need protecting from, horse trader?" "Everything, probably," he had admitted. "I'm not much of a fighter." "No," she'd agreed, looking him over the way she might look over a horse herself, taking in his plain brown coat, his calloused but unscarred hands, the careful, watchful way he held himself like a man perpetually bracing for a blow that had not yet come. "You are not." He had expected her to turn him away then. Instead, she had set down her whetstone, stood unfolding to her full height in a way that made him take an involuntary step back, and said, "I have not decided yet whether I like you. But I have decided I am bored of this fair already, and you look like you might at least be interesting to guard. Show me your coin." That had been the whole of it. That had been enough. Now 2 months later, sitting on an upturned crate near the medicine stalls, while an old herb woman cleaned the scrape on Borgakh's forearm with something that smelled sharply of crushed mint and vinegar, Samuel found himself watching the orc woman's face, rather than her wound the small flinch she refused to show, the way her jaw set even against a pain she would never admit to feeling. "You didn't have to throw yourself in front of that knife," he said quietly. "I did not throw myself in front of it. I moved you and then I dealt with the thrower. There is a difference." "Borgakh." She looked at him. It was rare that he said her name plainly like that, without title, without the careful distance he usually kept, and something in her expression flickered at the sound of it. "Drenach Ashfang wants you dead because he can't have you," Samuel said. "That's not guard work. That's," he struggled for the word, "that's someone trying to kill the woman he stopped himself." "Finish it," she said, very quietly, her eyes fixed on him now with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "The woman I've come to care about," Samuel said, and it cost him more to say than any lie he'd told in 3 years of hiding, because it was the truth, and the truth was far more dangerous. Borgakh was silent for a long moment. The herb woman finished binding the wound and shuffled off without a word, sensing, as most people around them seemed to sense, that something delicate was happening that did not want an audience. "You should not care about me," Borgakh said finally. "I am hired. When the fair ends, I go where the next coin takes me. That's not an answer to what I said, that's just you telling me the rules. The rules exist because they are true. Rules can be wrong." He held her gaze, which was harder than it sounded, because her eyes had a way of making a man feel entirely seen, entirely known, in a way he had spent 3 years avoiding. "You threw yourself between me and a knife today. That's the 4th time. You didn't have to do any of that. Guards keep their charges alive. They don't leap in front of blades meant for someone else's heart. I did what was necessary." "Was it necessary the time you carried me half a mile after that wagon wheel crushed my foot, when you could have just sent for a cart? The cart would have taken too long. Was it necessary to sit with me at my fire until dawn after I couldn't sleep from the pain, telling me stories about your clan's winter hunts, when you could have just told me to be quiet and let you rest?" Borgakh's jaw tightened. "You were in pain. It seemed cruel to leave you alone with it." "Was it necessary?" Samuel said, softer now, leaning forward on the crate, close enough that he could smell wood smoke and leather and something warmer beneath it that was only her. "To bite my shoulder the night we camped by Widow's Creek, when I said something that made you laugh?" He watched color rise in her cheeks, a deep flush beneath the green that she could not hide any better than a human woman could in. For the first time since he'd known her, Borgakh Frostwolf looked almost caught, almost cornered by a question instead of a blade. That had happened 3 weeks ago, and Samuel had thought about it every day since. They had been camped along Widow's Creek on the outer edge of the fairground, away from the crowds and the noise, because Borgakh had said she could not think clearly with so many strange bodies pressed close, and Samuel, grateful for any excuse to have her attention undivided, had built up the fire and made a joke about the way she ate, tearing into roasted rabbit with more enthusiasm than table manners, comparing her to a wolf he'd once seen demolish a chicken coop. She had laughed, a real laugh, rare and startling, throwing her head back so the firelight caught the long, clean line of her throat. And then, still laughing, she had leaned over and closed her teeth gently around the meat of his shoulder through his shirt, not hard enough to bruise, not soft enough to be nothing, and held it there for one long, charged second before releasing him and going back to her rabbit as though nothing had happened at all. He had sat frozen, Every nerve in his shoulder lit up like a struck match, his whole body suddenly, achingly aware of her in a way he hadn't let himself be before. "What was that?" he had asked when he could speak again. "Nothing," she had said too quickly. "A thing my clan does. It is not," she'd stopped, frowning as though searching for words that had gotten away from her. "It is not affection. It felt like something. It is a habit, from childhood. Wolf cubs do it to test each other's throats. It means nothing between us." She had not looked at him when she said it, which told him more than the words did. He had let it drop that night, because pushing further had felt like pushing at a door she was not ready to open. And he was, above everything else, a patient man had learned patience the hard way. In the 3 years since disgrace had stripped his name and his lands and left him with nothing but the slow, careful work of rebuilding a life brick by brick under a false name. But the bite had stayed with him. He'd felt the ghost of it on his shoulder for days. Now, sitting on the crate with her wound freshly bound, and Drenach Ashfang's threat hanging in the air between them like smoke that would not clear, Samuel decided he was done being patient about that particular question. "You bit me," he said, "and you told me it wasn't affection. I've thought about that every day since, Borgakh, because I don't understand it and I think you don't either. So I'm asking you plainly. If it wasn't affection, what was it then?" Borgakh opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. She looked away from him, out toward the crowded fairground, her jaw working, her hands that had thrown Drenach Ashfang into a cart of pumpkins without visible effort curling into fists on her knees, as though she needed somewhere to put the feeling that had no words attached to it yet. "I do not know," she said finally, so quietly he almost didn't hear it over the noise of the fair. "I have never," she stopped again, shook her head. "I have killed men who looked at me the way Drenach looks at me. I have turned away clan champions who offered me cattle and blades and their fathers' names. I did not want any of it, and I did not think about it after I said no. But you," her golden eyes came back to his face, and there was something raw in them now, something she had clearly not intended to show him. "You, I think about, I do not know what to call that. I only know it is not nothing, and I do not think it is only guarding." Samuel's heart was pounding so hard he was certain she could hear it. "Borgakh, do not," she said, holding up a hand, though there was no real force behind it. "Do not say something neither of us can take back in the middle of a grain market with half the fair still staring." He looked around. She was right. Curious eyes were still drifting toward them, whispers passing between stall keepers who had clearly witnessed the fight with Drenach and were now watching the aftermath with the same appetite they'd bring to a traveling player's show. "Then walk with me," Samuel said. "Away from the stalls, please." She looked at him for a long moment and then, slowly, she nodded. They left the grain market behind and walked along the river path that skirted the edge of the fairground, where the crowds thinned to farmers leading livestock and children chasing each other between wagon wheels. The autumn afternoon had turned gold and long-shadowed, the river running fast and brown with the first of the mountain melt, and somewhere upstream, a mill wheel turned with a steady, creaking rhythm that filled the silence between them until Samuel finally broke it. "I need to tell you something about myself," he said, "something I haven't told anyone in 3 years. Borgakh's eyes cut to him, sharp with attention. "You are not truly a horse trader. How did you know that? You hold a sword like a man who was once taught properly and has been trying to forget the lessons. You flinch when heralds sound their horns. You know how to bow the way nobles are taught to bow, though you have tried very hard to unlearn it. I am not a fool, Samuel Wells. I simply did not ask because it was not my business unless you made it mine." He let out a breath, half a laugh, half something closer to relief. "My name is not really Wells. I was a knight once. A minor one, not lord's blood, just a landed knight sworn to House Ardennes, up along the eastern marches. 3 years ago I was given command of a border garrison during a raid, and I made a call that got men killed. I thought I was protecting the villages behind us. I thought I was right." He looked at the river, not at her, because it was easier to say this to moving water than to her face. I was wrong. 11 men died because of a choice I made, and though the inquiry cleared me of cowardice, it did not clear me of the deaths, and my lord stripped my spurs and my lands rather than have my failure reflect on his house. I took a new name and went west, and I have been Samuel Wells ever since, buying and selling horses I mostly cannot judge properly, because it seemed like a life small enough that it could not hurt anyone else. Borgakh was quiet for a long moment. You believe you are a coward. I believe I got 11 men killed. That is not the same thing. Her voice was firm, almost sharp. I have led war bands, Samuel. I have made calls in the heat of battle that cost lives, calls that seemed right with the information I had, and proved wrong only after the blood was already spilled. Any warrior who tells you they have never done this is lying to you, or they have never truly led anyone at all. The measure is not whether you have never failed. The measure is what you do after. She stopped walking, turning to face him fully, the river wind pulling loose strands of dark hair across her face. You took the guilt onto yourself rather than blaming your lord for putting an untested knight in that position. You hid yourself away rather than seeking glory elsewhere under your true name. You have spent 3 years small and careful because you believed you owed the world that smallness. That is not cowardice. That is a man trying, clumsily, to atone for something that was never fully his to atone for alone. Samuel stared at her. He had told this story exactly once before, to the magistrate at his inquiry, and never since. Not to a friend, not to a lover, not even fully to himself in the quiet hours when guilt liked to visit. He had not expected to hear it handed back to him gentler than he'd given it. "You're the first person who's ever said that to me," he said, his voice rough. "Then the people around you before were fools," Borgakh said simply, "or you never let them close enough to say it." "I didn't let anyone close enough," he admitted. "Not until you." The words hung between them, and this time she did not deflect them. She reached out slowly and touched the side of his face with fingers that could crush stone, and instead moved like she was afraid of breaking something far more fragile than he actually was. "I told you the bite was not affection," she said quietly. "I have been telling myself the same lie for 3 weeks. I do not know how to be soft, Samuel. My clan does not raise its daughters soft. I have killed men for less insult than Drenach gave you today. I do not know the words for what grows in my chest when I look at you, because no one ever taught me those words, and I am afraid that if I say them wrong, I will break something I did not mean to touch." "You won't break me," Samuel said. "I'm sturdier than I look." A small, unwilling smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. "You are a horse trader who cannot judge a good horse. I judged you well enough. You did not judge me at all. You asked a stranger with an axe to protect you and got lucky." "I don't think it was luck," Samuel said, and reached up to cover her hand where it rested against his cheek. "I think some part of me knew, the moment I saw you, that you were the first safe thing I'd found in 3 years. And I don't mean safe like nothing could hurt me. I mean safe like I didn't have to hide from you. You saw right through the name, right through the coat, right to whatever was left of the man underneath, and you didn't flinch." Borgakh's throat worked. Her thumb traced once gently along his cheekbone. "I do not flinch from much," she said, but her voice had gone thick, uneven in a way he had never heard from her before. "You are the only thing that has ever made me want to." He turned his face into her palm, pressing a kiss there, and felt her whole body still like a held breath. "Samuel," she said, half a warning, half something closer to plea. "Tell me to stop," he said, "and I will, but I don't think you want me to." She did not tell him to stop. Instead, she leaned down. She had to lean, being so much taller than him, and kissed him, and it was nothing like he had imagined in 3 weeks of imagining it. He had thought, if it ever happened, it would be careful, tentative, the kind of kiss that tested the water before committing. Instead, Borgakh kissed him like a woman who had spent years holding a door shut against a storm, and had finally, deliberately, thrown it open, fierce and hungry and unguarded, one hand fisting in the front of his coat to pull him closer. the other still cradling his jaw as though he were something precious, even as she kissed him like he was something she'd been starving for. He made a small helpless sound against her mouth and felt her answering growl low in her chest, and when they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, her forehead came down to rest against his. "That," she said, "was not affection either, I suppose you will tell me." "I think it was exactly affection," Samuel said, laughing breathlessly. "I think it was affection wearing very sharp teeth." Borgakh laughed too then, the real laugh, the rare one, the one that had made him fall a little further the first time he heard it. And for a moment, standing on the river path with the mill wheel turning behind them and the autumn light going amber gold across the water, Samuel Wells felt something in his chest, a knot that had been knotted for 3 long years. It did not last, of course. Nothing good in that world lasted without a fight to keep it. That night at the edge of the fairground where the traders had pitched their tents in loose rows along the river, Samuel woke to the sound of raised voices outside his tent and emerged to find Borgakh standing toe-to-toe with Borgakh Frostwolf beneath a hunter's moon. 3 of his kinsmen fanned out behind him with hands resting meaningfully on axe hafts. "The council has ruled," Borgakh was saying, holding up a folded parchment sealed with red wax. "Your father's promise stands. You are to return to the Frostwolf camp before the fair closes and stand before the elders to be claimed, as was agreed before his death." "My father agreed to nothing binding," Borgakh said. "A father's word is not a chain on a grown daughter, Borgakh, whatever the elders wish it to mean. I told you this in the spring. I told you again in summer. I am telling you a third time now, under the moon, so there is no claim afterward that I was unclear. I will not be claimed by you. You would choose a landless human over your own bloodline." Borgakh's voice cracked with something that might have been fury and might have been genuine hurt, though Samuel found it hard to summon much sympathy for a man who had thrown a knife at his throat that same afternoon. "You would shame the Frostwolf name for a man who cannot even lift a proper blade." "I would choose him over you 100 times, and I would not call it shame once," Borgakh said, and her hand went to the axe at her hip, not drawing it, but making very clear she could. "Take your parchment back to the elders and tell them the council can rule on cattle and grazing rights all it likes. It has no authority over my heart, and it never will." Borgakh's eyes flicked past her to Samuel, standing now at the mouth of his tent in his sleep shirt, feeling entirely underdressed for a confrontation involving 4 armed clansmen. "This is not finished," Borgakh said. "The elders will not accept refusal twice over. There will be a formal challenge before the fair closes, a claiming duel, as is our right under the old laws. If I win, she comes to the Frostwolf camp bound by custom, whether she wishes it or not. If I lose," he bared his teeth in something that was not quite a smile. "I will not lose." "Then you will have your duel," Borgakh said, without hesitation, "and you will learn what losing feels like for the second time in one day." Borgakh and his kinsmen withdrew into the dark, and Borgakh stood watching them go with her jaw tight and her hand still resting on her axe, and Samuel came to stand beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed her arm. "A claiming duel," he said. "That's real. That's a real thing that's going to happen." "It is real," Borgakh said grimly. "And it is old law that even I cannot simply refuse without consequence. If I do not meet him, the elders may strip my trading rights along this river, may bar me from clan lands entirely. It is a cruelty dressed as tradition, meant to force women who would rather choose freely into choosing the strongest instead." She looked down at Samuel, and something in her face softened even through the anger. "But I am not afraid of Borgakh Frostwolf. I have beaten stronger men than him. I will beat him again, publicly, before every witness at this fair, and there will be no more doubt in anyone's mind about who I have chosen." "I don't want you fighting for me," Samuel said. "Not because I doubt you. I don't. Not for a second, but because I don't want you hurt over a claim on you that should never have existed in the first place." Borgakh took his face in both hands then, gently, the way she had by the river, and looked at him with an intensity that made the cool night air feel suddenly very warm. I am not fighting for you, Samuel. I am fighting for myself, and for the right to choose my own life. You are simply the man I have chosen to build that life around. There is a difference, and it matters to me that you understand it. I understand it, Samuel said quietly. I just wish it didn't have to be a fight at all. It always was going to be a fight, Borgakh said. The world we live in does not hand a woman like me a soft path, and it does not hand a man like you an easy road either. We take what we want with both hands, or we do not get to keep it. I would rather fight for you and win than never have fought at all. He kissed her then, there in the moonlight outside his tent, softer than the kiss by the river but no less certain, and when they finally parted she rested her forehead against his once more and murmured, "Whatever happens in that duel, Samuel Wells, know that I chose this. I chose you. No council, no clan law, no knife in the dark will change that." The duel was set for 3 days hence, on the great open green at the heart of the fairground, where the harvest games were traditionally held, foot races, and axe-throwing and tests of strength that drew crowds from every stall and wagon for half a mile around. Word of it spread through Kelder's Bend like fire through dry grass, and by the morning of the appointed day, nearly the entire fair had turned out to watch, humans and orcs alike crowding 3 deep around a roped square of trampled grass, merchants abandoning their stalls, farmers leaving their livestock tethered and unwatched, all of them drawn by the promise of blood and spectacle. Samuel stood near the front of the crowd, close enough to see everything, his stomach twisted into a knot that would not loosen no matter how many times he told himself Borgakh was the finest warrior he had ever seen fight. He had spent the 3 days since the confrontation trying to be useful in whatever small ways he could, sharpening her axe himself, though she'd laughed kindly at his technique and finished the job properly afterward. Bringing her food she barely touched, too focused to eat much. Sitting with her at the fire each night while she ran through old forms with her blade, her movements sharp and controlled and utterly without wasted motion. He had also, on the 2nd night, done something he had not told her about yet. He had gone, alone in the dark, to find the clan elder who traveled with the Ashfang delegation, an ancient orc woman named Ulka Ironbrow, who was said to have judged claiming duels for 40 years, and brooked no argument from anyone, human or orc, about how the old laws should be read. He had found her at her fire on the edge of the Ashfang camp, and he had knelt, not out of submission, but because it seemed the respectful thing to do before an elder of a people not his own, and asked her a single question. If a woman wins a claiming duel outright, he had asked, does the law require anything further of her, or is the matter settled? Old Ulka had looked at him for a long moment with eyes clouded by age but sharp as ever underneath. The law requires nothing further, she had said. A woman who wins her own claiming duel is free to choose as she pleases forever after without challenge from that suitor's line again. This is old law, human, older than the Ashfang claim on your Borgakh. Why do you ask? Because I want to be sure, Samuel had said, that when she wins, and she will win, this ends, completely. No more knives in the dark. No more parchments, no more Drenak. Ulka had studied him for a long moment, something almost like respect moving behind her clouded eyes. You love her, she had said. It was not a question either. More than I have ever loved anything, Samuel had answered, and found that saying it aloud to a stranger's fire felt easier than he'd expected, now that he had already said the harder version of it to Borgakh herself. Then know this, human, Ulka had said. If she wins, and she chooses you before the whole fair afterward, no elder, no council, no clan law will have any further claim to make. It will be finished, and finished cleanly, and I will say so myself before every witness present, so there is no room left for Drenak Ashfang or any other man to argue otherwise. She had paused. But know also that claiming duels are not gentle things. Watch closely, human, and be ready to catch her if she falls. He had not told Borgakh about that conversation. He had not wanted to add the weight of his fear to whatever weight she already carried into the fight. But he carried Ulka's words with him now, standing at the edge of the roped square with the whole fair pressing in around him, and he held on to them like a talisman as Borgakh Frostwolf strode out onto the trampled grass to meet Drenach Ashfang beneath a sky the color of beaten iron. She had left her usual fitted leathers on. There had been no time, nor any tradition demanding otherwise, for a change of armor. But she had unbound her braid and let her black hair hang loose and wild around her shoulders, and Samuel understood, watching her, that this was itself a kind of statement. She was not dressing for Drenach's approval, or the elders' approval, or anyone's approval but her own. She looked magnificent and terrible, her amber eyes fixed on her opponent with an expression that held no fear at all, only cold, focused purpose. Drenach had stripped to the waist, his chest and arms a canvas of old battle scars, his great axe larger even than Borgakh's resting easily across his shoulders as he circled the edge of the square. "Last chance, Frostwolf," he called, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Yield now and I will be merciful. Fight, and I will not hold back simply because you are a woman." "I would be insulted if you held back," Borgakh called back, drawing her axe from its harness with a rasp of steel that seemed to silence the last murmurs of the crowd. "Come and try your mercy, Drenach Ashfang. See how far it carries you." Old Ulka Ironbrow, standing at the edge of the square with a ceremonial staff planted in the trampled grass, raised her voice to carry over the crowd. "This is a claiming duel, sanctioned under old law, witnessed by clan and by fair alike. It ends when one combatant yields, falls, or cannot continue. There will be no killing blow struck upon a fallen opponent. Any who breaks this law forfeits all claim, present and future, regardless of the duel's outcome. Do both combatants understand?" "I understand," Borgakh said. Drenach gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes never leaving Borgakh. "Then begin," Ulka said, and struck her staff once against the ground. What followed was the most terrifying thing Samuel had ever watched with his own eyes, more frightening than the day 11 men had died under his command, because this time the danger belonged to someone he loved rather than to strangers under his authority, and there was nothing he could do but stand at the rope's edge with his hands clenched into fists and watch. Drenach came in first, fast for a man his size, his great axe swinging in a low arc meant to take Borgakh's legs out from under her. She leapt back, let the axe pass beneath her, and used the half-second it took him to recover his swing to close the distance and drive the flat of her axe head into his ribs with a crack that made the crowd gasp as one. He staggered but did not fall, pivoting with surprising speed to bring his axe haft up and catch her across the shoulder, knocking her half a step sideways. They traded blows for what felt to Samuel like an eternity, but could not have been more than a few minutes, steel ringing against steel, the crowd roaring with every exchange, Drenach's raw strength meeting Borgakh's speed and precision again and again, without either gaining clear advantage. Borgakh took a shallow cut along her forearm that sent a thin line of green blood spattering across the grass. Drenach took a blow to the knee that made him limp for 3 full exchanges before he shook it off. Samuel's throat had gone raw from shouting encouragement he wasn't even aware he was giving. Then Drenach did something that made the crowd's roar turn to an ugly, uncertain murmur. He fainted low, and when Borgakh shifted to block it, he dropped his axe entirely and grabbed her by the wrist instead, using his far greater raw strength to wrench her off balance and drive a knee into her stomach that doubled her over and sent her sprawling onto the trampled grass, her own axe skittering away from her outstretched hand. "Yield," Drenach said, standing over her, breathing hard, his fists clenched at his sides. "Yield now, Borgakh, and this ends without further shame." Samuel's whole body went cold. He was halfway over the rope before he even registered moving, some animal instinct screaming at him to get to her, duel or no duel, law or no law, and it was only Ulka Ironbrow's staff slamming down in front of him, barring his path, that stopped him from breaking the sanctity of the square. "She has not fallen and she has not called yield," Ulka said sharply. "Wait, human, trust her." Samuel forced himself to stop, chest heaving, and looked back at the square just as Borgakh, still on the ground, drove her heel up and back into the side of Drenak's already injured knee with brutal, precise force. He howled and staggered, and in the half-second his balance broke, Borgakh rolled, snatched a fistful of trampled grass and dirt from the ground, and flung it into his eyes as she surged back to her feet. She did not go for her fallen axe. She went for him directly, driving her shoulder into his chest, and using his own stumbling weight against him, and the two of them went down together in a tangle that ended with Borgakh straddling him, one knee pinning his sword arm, her forearm braced hard across his throat, not choking, but close enough that the threat was unmistakable. "Yield," she said, echoing his own word back at him, her voice low and furious and utterly without mercy now. "Yield, Drenakh, or I will finish this the way the old laws allow, and we both know I am within my right to do it." For a long moment Drenakh did not answer, his chest heaving beneath her knee, his eyes, still streaming from the dirt she'd thrown, fixed on her face with an expression of raw, humiliated fury. Then slowly his hand opened where it had still been fisted, and he tapped the ground twice, the old sign of surrender. "I yield," he said, thick with disgust, mostly at himself. Borgakh released him at once, rising to her feet in one smooth motion, and the crowd erupted. Not entirely in her favor, Samuel noted, some of the Ashfang kinsmen and their sympathizers looking on with dark, unhappy faces, but the greater roar was one of genuine, roused appreciation for a fight well fought and fairly won. Ulka Ironbrow raised her staff and struck the ground 3 times, and the crowd's noise dropped enough for her voice to carry. "The duel is decided. Borgakh Frostwolf has won her claiming cleanly, under old law and before full witness. Let it be known and remembered no further challenge may be raised against her choice, not by Drenakh Ashfang, not by any other suitor, not by council decree. She is free, and she has won that freedom with her own hands." Borgakh stood in the center of the square, breathing hard, blood trickling from the cut on her forearm, her hair wild and loose around her shoulders, and turned, not toward the elders, not toward the murmuring crowd, but toward Samuel, standing at the rope's edge with his heart still hammering and his eyes wet with something he was too relieved to be ashamed of. She crossed the square to him without a word, ducked under the rope, and took his face in both her blood-streaked hands in front of the entire fair, 400 witnesses or more, and kissed him deep and fierce and utterly unashamed, the kind of kiss that left no room for anyone watching to doubt what it meant. "I told you," she murmured against his mouth, when they finally broke apart to the sound of the crowd's stunned, delighted uproar, "that I choose you, Samuel Wells. Now the whole fair has seen it, and no one may say otherwise again." Samuel laughed, half breathless, wiping a smear of green blood from her cheek with his thumb. "I've never been so terrified and so happy at the same time in my whole life." "Get used to it," Borgakh said, grinning fiercely despite the split in her lip and the cut on her arm. "I intend to make a habit of it. They should have had peace after that. For a few golden days they nearly did." The fair moved into its final week with the particular electric energy that always came before an ending, traders slashing prices to clear stock before the roads north closed for winter, farmers racing to sell the last of their harvest, musicians playing louder and longer into the night as though trying to hold the season by force. Samuel sold 3 horses at a fair price for the first time all season. A small victory he attributed entirely to the fact that Borgakh stood beside him at every negotiation, looking pleasant enough to smile, but dangerous enough that no buyer tried to cheat him twice. In the evenings they walked the river path together, no longer needing an excuse of guard duty to justify the closeness, and Borgakh told him things she had never told anyone about her mother, dead in a border skirmish when Borgakh was barely a woman grown. About her father, a hard man who had loved her in his own rough way but had never understood a daughter who wanted to choose her own path rather than walk the one laid out for her. About the scar beneath her collar, which she finally showed him one evening by the fire, unlacing the top of her bodice just enough to reveal a long, pale line across her collarbone. "A raid when I was 19, she said, watching his face carefully as he traced the old scar with gentle fingers. "A human blade, though not one wielded in malice. The man who cut me was terrified, defending his home, and I do not blame him for it even now. I nearly died. It is the closest I have ever come." She caught his hand, pressed it flat over the scar, over the steady beat of her heart beneath it. "I tell you this because I want you to know all of me, Samuel. Not only the parts that are easy to love." "There isn't a part of you that isn't easy to love," Samuel said, and meant it completely, and watched her golden eyes go soft and startled, as though the sentence had reached somewhere in her that very few people had ever been permitted to touch. That night, for the first time, she stayed in his tent rather than her own, and what passed between them was unhurried and deeply tender despite the hunger beneath it, her guarded warrior's heart opening to him one careful inch at a time. The way she let him unlace her armor piece by piece, as though giving him permission for each layer stripped away. The way she trembled, actually trembled, beneath his hands in a way the fiercest warrior at the fair would never have believed possible of Borgakh Frostwolf. Afterward, in the dark, wrapped together beneath a single blanket too small for her frame, she pressed her lips to his shoulder, the very shoulder she had bitten weeks before, and murmured against his skin, "I think I know now what it was." "What was?" Samuel asked, half asleep, running a lazy hand through her loose hair. "The bite," she said, "by Widow's Creek. I told you it was not affection, and I did not know what else to call it, because I had never felt anything like it before and had no word ready for it." She lifted her head, looking down at him in the dim firelight filtering through the tent canvas, her expression open in a way he had rarely seen. "I know the word now, Samuel. It was wanting. It was my whole body trying to tell you something my mouth was too frightened to say. I wanted to mark you as mine before I understood what mine even meant. It was never nothing. It has never once been nothing." Samuel felt his chest ache with a fullness he had no adequate way to express, so instead he pulled her down and kissed her slow and thorough, and let the kiss say what words could not quite finish. He should have known peace like that could not last through to the fair's end. It never did, in a world like theirs. The trouble came 4 days later, on a morning when half the fairground packed its wagons early to beat a storm rolling down off the mountains. A storm the old weather readers among the traders had been muttering about for 2 days, dark clouds stacking on the peaks like an omen nobody wanted to name aloud. Borgakh and Samuel had planned to leave with the last wave of traders, taking the old river road south along Kelder's Bend, before turning toward the winter pastures where Borgakh kept a small holding of her own, half-forgotten grazing land inherited from an aunt, where she said they could shelter through the cold months and decide together what came after. They were 3 miles out from the fairground, crossing the old stone bridge that spanned the gorge above the Kelder River, a bridge that had stood, weathered but solid, for at least 2 generations, when the storm that had been threatening all morning broke early and violent, and the world Samuel thought he understood came apart beneath his feet. The rain hit first, a hard, sudden wall of it that turned visibility to gray soup within seconds, and then came the sound, a deep, groaning crack from somewhere beneath the bridge's ancient stones, the noise of centuries-old mortar finally giving way under a swollen river, running faster and higher than it had any right to run this early in the season. Samuel was leading his horse across the bridge's midpoint, Borgakh just behind him with her own mount, when the stone beneath his feet lurched sideways, and a section of the bridge's near railing simply crumbled away into the churning brown water below. "Samuel!" Borgakh's voice cut through the rain and the river's roar like a blade, and he turned to see the section of bridge directly ahead of him, the section he would have stepped onto in another heartbeat sag, and then collapse entirely, stone and mortar folding down into the gorge in a cascade of white spray and thunderous noise, taking his horse's forward path with it. His own mount screamed and reared, tearing the reins from his hand, and Samuel staggered backward on a stretch of bridge that was itself beginning to shudder and crack beneath his boots. There was no time to think. There was barely time to breathe. He felt the stone tilt beneath him, felt his footing go, and then Borgakh's hand closed around his wrist like an iron manacle and hauled him backward with a strength that nearly took his arm from its socket, dragging him bodily off the collapsing section just as it sheared away entirely and vanished into the flood below with a roar that swallowed even the storm. They hit the solid stone of the bridge's near end together, tangled and breathless, rain hammering down on them both, and for one terrible moment Samuel thought the whole structure was going to go, the ground shaking beneath them like something alive and dying. "We have to move now," Borgakh shouted over the storm, already pulling him up by the front of his coat. "The whole span is failing, look." He looked, and his stomach dropped through the bottom of the world. Further along the bridge, back toward the fairground side, another section was crumbling, the collapse spreading like a wound tearing wider, stone giving way to stone in a chain of destruction that was going to meet them in the middle if they did not outrun it. Behind them, the far bank, where they had been heading, was already lost, the bridge simply gone in that direction, a raw gap of churning brown water and empty air where solid stone had stood a minute before. "There's no way forward and no way back," Samuel shouted, panic clawing up his throat. "There is the river," Borgakh said, and before he could fully process what she meant, she had wrapped one massive arm around his waist, hauled him bodily off his feet, and was running along the crumbling, shuddering bridge toward a section still holding near its northern edge, where a jumble of fallen scaffolding from some long-abandoned repair work jutted out over the gorge like a broken rib. "Borgakh, what are you doing?" "Trust me," she said, and it was not a question, and he did completely, entirely, with everything left in him. As she leapt from the failing bridge onto the scaffolding with him still held against her side, the old wooden framework groaning and swaying but holding just long enough for her to half climb, half throw them both down its angled length toward a rocky outcropping that jutted from the gorge wall a dozen feet above the flood. The bridge behind them gave way entirely in a final, catastrophic roar, the whole ancient span folding into the river in a wall of white spray and tumbling stone, and the scaffolding beneath their feet shuddered from the shockwave and began, slowly, to tear free from the crumbling wall it had been anchored to. "Jump!" Borgakh roared and shoved him hard, deliberate, no hesitation toward the rocky outcropping even as the scaffolding beneath her own feet gave way. Samuel hit the wet rock hard, scrambling for purchase, twisting around in time to see Borgakh, a heartbeat behind him, throw herself off the collapsing wood with everything her powerful frame could give the leap. She did not quite make the outcropping. Her hands caught the edge of the rock, her body swinging down into open air above the roaring flood, her feet scrabbling against wet stone that offered no purchase at all. "Samuel," she got out, strained, her fingers already sliding. He did not think. He threw himself flat on the outcropping, reached down into the driving rain, and caught her wrist in both hands with every ounce of strength his ordinary, unwarrior body possessed, digging his knees against a jut of rock to anchor himself as her full weight came down against his grip like the world's cruelest test of will. "I've got you," he shouted, though his shoulders screamed and his hands were already slipping in the rain-slick grip. "I've got you. I am not letting go. Do you hear me? I am not letting go." Borgakh's other hand found a crack in the rock, and she hauled herself up with a raw, furious cry of effort, her boots finally finding purchase, and between her own desperate strength and his stubborn, unyielding grip, she came up and over the edge of the outcropping and collapsed against him. Both of them soaked through and shaking and gasping for air, while the river roared past a dozen feet below where they lay tangled together on the wet stone. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Rain hammered down around them, the last echoes of the bridge's collapse still rumbling away down the gorge, and Samuel simply held on to her, arms wrapped around her broad shoulders as tightly as he could manage, feeling her heart pound against his chest as hard as his own. "You caught me," Borgakh finally said, her voice cracked and disbelieving. "I outweigh you by half again, Samuel, and you caught me." I told you, Samuel said, half laughing, half sobbing with the release of terror. I wasn't letting go. I don't care what it costs me. I am never letting go of you. Borgakh pulled back just enough to look at him, rain running down both their faces, her golden eyes wide and stripped of every wall she usually kept up. You could have died, reaching for me like that. If your grip had failed, then we'd have gone into that river together, Samuel said simply, and I would rather that than let you fall alone. Something broke open in her face at that, some final, guarded thing giving way at last, and she kissed him there on the wet stone above the roaring flood, with a desperation that had nothing careful left in it at all, both of them shaking with cold and relief, and something far larger than either. They found a way down the gorge wall eventually, once the worst of the storm passed, a slow and careful descent along a game trail Borgakh's sharp orc eyes spotted through the rain, and made their way on foot to a small trapper's shelter a mile downriver where they built a fire, stripped off their soaked clothes to dry, and held each other through the night beneath borrowed blankets, neither willing to let the other out of arms reach even in sleep. In the morning, with the storm blown out and the sky washed clean and pale, they walked the last stretch back toward Kelder's Bend to report the bridge's collapse and collect what remained of their scattered horses. Samuel's had been found grazing calmly a half-mile downriver, entirely unaware of the catastrophe it had caused by bolting, while Borgakh's mount had simply refused to cross the bridge at all and had waited sensibly on the near bank the whole time. It was there, on the road back into the fairground's outer edge, that they found Drenach Ashfang waiting for them, not with kinsmen this time, not with a knife or an axe, but alone, standing beside his own horse with an expression Samuel had not seen on him before, something tired, something almost humbled. I heard about the bridge, Drenach said as they approached. I am glad you both survived it. That is unexpectedly kind of you, Borgakh said, wary but not hostile. I have had 4 days to sit with my defeat, Drenach said. The council has stripped none of my Rankulka Ironbrow, made certain the whole fair understood the duel was fair and final, but I have had time to think on what she said to me, in the moment I yielded, that I was fighting for a claim I never truly had over a heart that was never mine to win. He looked briefly, uncomfortably, at Samuel. I do not love you, horse trader. I do not think I ever will. But I have watched you these last days, asking after Frostwolf honor customs from Olka herself, sharpening a warrior's axe though your hands were clearly unused to the work, and now surviving a collapsing bridge at her side rather than fleeing without her. Whatever else you are not a coward, and you did not win her by trickery or by law alone. You won her honestly. He extended a hand, orc fashion, forearm to forearm. I withdraw my grievance, fully, before witnesses if the elders require it. Samuel, startled, clasped the offered forearm, and Drenach gave a short, stiff nod before mounting his horse and riding on without further ceremony, leaving the two of them standing on the road in the pale morning light. Well, Samuel said after a moment, I did not expect that. Nor did I, Borgakh admitted. Perhaps the bridge shook something loose in more than just the stones. She turned to him, and there was a new lightness in her face, the last shadow of the claiming duel and Drenach's threat finally, fully lifted. It is over, Samuel, truly over. No more knives, no more councils, no more parchments with red wax. Then what happens now? Samuel asked. Borgakh reached out and took both his hands in hers, calloused palm against calloused palm, and for the first time since he had known her, he saw something like uncertainty flicker across her fierce features. Not fear, but the particular vulnerability of a woman about to say something that mattered more than any duel she had ever fought. Now, she said, I ask you a question I have never asked any man because I have never wanted to before. Samuel Wells, or whatever name you choose to carry, knight or horse trader or something else entirely, it does not matter to me which. Will you come with me? Not as a guard's charge, not as a fair's fleeting companion. I have a small holding in the winter pastures south of here, half wild and mostly forgotten, and I would rather build something there with you than spend one more season alone, guarding strangers for coin, while my heart sits empty in my chest waiting for a man brave enough to reach into a flood and refuse to let go of me." Samuel felt his throat tighten, felt 3 years of careful, guarded smallness finally, fully crack open like the bridge stone had cracked beneath his feet, letting something long buried rush up into the light. "Borgakh Frostwolf," he said, "I have spent 3 years hiding from a world I thought had no place left for me in it. I don't want to hide anymore. I want to build something real with you, out in the open where the whole world can see it, and I don't care if that world is a winter pasture or a war camp or the middle of a storm-broken bridge. Yes, I will come with you. I would follow you anywhere." She kissed him then, slow and sure, no crowd left to witness it, no duel left to prove, nothing left between them but the simple, hard-won fact of two people who had chosen each other with open eyes and would go on choosing each other, day after day, for as long as they both drew breath. They did not linger long in Kelder's Bend after that. There was little enough left to keep them. Samuel sold off the last of his horses at a fair price to a trader heading east, keeping only the 2 mounts he and Borgakh would need for the road south, and settled his few debts with the quiet satisfaction of a man closing a chapter of his life he no longer needed to carry. Borgakh, for her part, collected her final wages from the mercenary post and told the postmaster, with a fierce grin that left no room for argument, that she would not be taking further contracts through Kelder's Bend, not because the coin wasn't good, but because she had found something worth more than any purse a hiring post could offer. They rode out of the fairground on a bright, cold morning, with the last of the season's traders still striking their tents behind them, the great harvest fair already beginning to fold itself away for another year, wagons rattling off in every direction toward homes and holdings scattered across the wide frontier. Samuel looked back once, at the trampled green where a claiming duel had been fought and won, at the river path where he had first heard the word wanting fall from Borgakh's lips like a confession finally spoken aloud, and felt no pull to stay. Whatever he had been looking for when he first came to this fair under a false name and a smaller life, it was not behind him anymore. It was riding beside him, in the shape of a fierce, scarred, magnificent woman who had chosen him, again and again, with her whole unguarded heart. The road south wound through hill country turning gold and red with the last of autumn, and they rode it easily, unhurried, stopping when they pleased, sharing a fire and a bowl of stew most nights at whatever wayside camp offered good water and decent grazing. Borgakh taught him, along that road, the proper way to hold an axe, not because she expected him to become a warrior, but because she said a man who rode beside her ought to know how to defend himself if the world ever demanded it of him again. And he found, to his own surprise, that he was not half so hopeless with a blade as 3 years of horse-trading humility had led him to believe. Samuel, in turn, taught her the small, patient art of judging a good horse from a bad one, a skill she picked up with unfair speed and used mercilessly to tease him about every poor trade he'd ever made. On the 5th night of the ride south, camped beneath a stand of old oaks with the first true frost silvering the grass, Borgakh pulled a small object from the pouch at her belt and held it out to him without preamble, a simple braided leather cord, worked through with a single carved wolf's tooth, old and worn smooth with handling. "This was my mother's," she said. "A binding cord, in the old way of my clan, given by a woman to the one she chooses to walk beside her, forever after, no counsel or duel or law required to make it true. It is not a marriage as your people understand marriage, with priests and papers. It is older than that and simpler. It means, I have chosen you, and I will go on choosing you, and there is no ceremony on earth that could make that truth any more real than it already is." She held it out, her hand steady despite the rawness in her voice. "I am asking you to wear it, Samuel, if you want to." Samuel took the cord with hands that trembled slightly, and looked at her, this fierce, magnificent woman who had thrown herself between him and a knife, who had fought a claiming duel before 400 witnesses and won, who had hauled him bodily off a collapsing bridge, and then let him catch her when she herself began to fall, who had bitten his shoulder in the firelight because her heart had known what she wanted before her mouth had words for it. "I want to," he said. "I have wanted to since the day I asked a stranger with an axe to protect me, and got so much more than protection in return." He tied the cord around his wrist himself, and Borgakh watched him do it with an expression of such open, unguarded tenderness that he understood, fully and completely, that whatever walls she had built around her heart over a hard life of duels and losses and clan expectations, those walls had come down for good, and he was the only man who had ever been let past them. "Borgakh Frostwolf," he said, when the cord was tied, "I love you. I don't have a binding cord of my own to give you, and I don't know all your clan's customs yet, but I know that much, plainly and completely, and I wanted to say it beneath an open sky where there's nothing between us and the truth of it." "I love you," Borgakh said back, simply, without hesitation, the words sitting easily in her mouth now where once they might have stuck the same woman who could not answer what her bite had meant 3 weeks and a lifetime ago, now answering every question he might ever ask her without a moment's doubt. "I did not think I would ever say that to anyone, Samuel. I did not think anyone would ever be worth the risk of it. You were worth it. You are worth everything." They did not marry in the way his old world would have understood marriage, with a priest and a keep hall and witnesses signing papers. That world had cast him out, after all, and he no longer owed it any ceremony. Instead, they rode on together in the golden autumn light, bound by an old orc custom and a newer, harder one truth, that a disgraced knight hiding under a false name and a fierce, scarred warrior who feared nothing had found, in each other, the one thing neither had believed they were still allowed to want: a home, not made of stone or land or clan law, but simply of each other, chosen freely, and never once let go. They reached the winter pasture 3 days later, a modest stretch of good grazing land tucked into a valley below the first true mountains, with an old stone cottage half-collapsed but salvageable, and a scattering of Borgakh's aunt's cattle still wild and hardy from years of neglect. It was not much to look at, not yet, but Samuel stood in the cottage's crumbling doorway with Borgakh's hand in his, looking out over land that was, for the first time in 3 years, genuinely theirs to build a life upon, and felt something settle deep in his chest that felt very much like peace. "It will take work," Borgakh said, surveying the fallen roof beams with a critical eye. "I'm good at work," Samuel said, "especially the kind that lasts." She turned to him, and there was no duel left to fight, no clan law left to satisfy, no false name left to hide behind, only the two of them, standing together at the edge of a new life neither had expected to find, and she smiled at him with her whole unguarded heart in her face. "Then let us begin it," Borgakh Frostwolf said, and pulled him inside out of the cold, into the home they would build together, one patient day at a time, bound by no law but their own choosing, and no chain but the one they had gladly, joyfully forged for themselves.